Hello and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be discussing some of the major news that has affected Israel and the Middle East this week, starting with the news that US Secretary of State John Kerry has started negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the first time this has happened in 3 years. So we'll be asking, what is the prospect for peace? The second part of the programme will be discussing the new Iranian President, Rouhani, who was inaugurated this week, and asking, is he really the reformer and the man that the West can do business with? And welcome to the Middle East Report. We're joined on the Middle East Report today by Dermot Keyhole, who is the Chief Executive Officer for BICOM. Dermot, it's a great pleasure to have you on the Middle East Report today. And when I phoned up your office to see if I get a spokesman from your organisation, I didn't expect the Chief Executive. So I'm very pleased that you're here on the programme.
Thank you, Simon. I'm delighted to be here.
And can you share something about your background? Because BICOM, your organisation, sent me a bio in which is really interesting. You have 20 years experience in public affairs, communications and journalism, a career in broadcasting that spans the BBC, ITV, GMTV and Channel 4 and communications at the Home Office. So can you tell us something about your illustrious career in the media?
I wouldn't go that far. My background started in broadcast journalism. I used to produce a programme on GMTV, went out very early in the morning on a Sunday. Our audience was largely families with young children and older people, but it was a current affairs magazine programme. Then after that, I went to the BBC, and I was there for nearly 10 years. Very much enjoyed the BBC. I moved into communications, doing policy and communications for the BBC. After the BBC, I left. I did a couple of documentary series for Channel 4. I did one on Iraq. We did a series of programmes on Iraq in about 2008. Wrote a report on that called the Iraq Commission, which was looking where policy should go. And I did a second one on knife crime, which was in the UK, which both of which were fascinating to do. And then I came back a couple of years ago to BICOM to do their media work. And in the last year, I've become chief executive. I first visited Israel back in the early 90s, just after when I just finished at college. The Oslo Accords had just been signed. It was a time of great optimism and hope for peace. And anyway, here I am with you 20 years later talking about the prospects for peace still.
Excellent. But where does your interest in Israel really stem from?
Well, it really stems from that visit I did as a young man. When I was finished college, I was very involved at that time in the National Union of Students and getting into journalism. And I had the opportunity to go and visit Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and I travelled around a lot of Israel. I'd had Jewish friends growing up, and so I knew something of Jewish culture. And then when I got there, I was fascinated. I mean, if anyone who's been to Israel, like many people, I fell in love with Israel. I mean, if you get to visit the old city,
absolutely. If
you get to visit and the tradition I've been brought up in, a Christian tradition, there are so many sites and references, and it is famously a magical place, and that started a love affair with Israel since then. I've gone on to do other things, mainly, as I said, in political journalism, broadcast journalism. When the opportunity came back to combine both my interest in communications with my love of Israel, it was a opportunity too good to miss.
Well, fantastic. So I'm very pleased you're in this position.
I'm delighted to be here.
And we also had we've had Professor Alan Johnson and Luke Akers from your organisation on previous editions of Middle East Report, and they've been very good. But can you share something with our viewers about the very important work that BICOM is doing on behalf of Israel?
Well, BICOM is the Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre. We're an independent UK organisation. We're independent of any government and the Israeli government, and we seek essentially to explain Israel better to people in the UK, and through doing so, to build more support for Israel. We do a lot of work with the media in the UK and with various opinion formers and policymakers. We have a research function. Dr. Johnson, Professor Johnson, I can't remember him yet. Professor Johnson heads up our research work and produces a journal, which is available from our website. Luke Akehurst runs an initiative of ours called We Believe in Israel, which is about empowering and equipping people who want to get involved and help Israel to do so. And we produce research and analysis, and we monitor both the media, both in Israel and the UK.
Excellent. Well, firstly, we've got the news this week that US Secretary of State John Kerry has opened the first peace negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians for 3 years. What do you make of these talks, and do you believe they can lead to peace?
Well, I believe they're very significant and very welcome. And in fact, although it's 3 years since the Israelis and Palestinians have spoken, you really have to go back to 2008 in Annapolis before there was a significant international American involvement. So I welcome them. I think they're significant. I think expectations are not necessarily very high this time, but that's no bad thing. I think they're realistic. As Secretary of State Kerry himself said when he announced these talks, he said no one ever lost money betting against peace. There are many people out there who are very sceptical of the chances of success. Personally, I wish them and hope them every success. I think one of the differences about this round is previously quite often the start of talks has been greeted with a great deal of idealism, a great deal of hope. There's been photo ops and celebrations and so on. I think partly this time they're starting in a very sober and realistic fashion, and that may be no bad thing.
And we got a news clip to go to now that looks at the US-sponsored peace negotiations that have started for the first time in 3 years between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Israel's chief negotiator with the Palestinians has voiced cautious optimism following talks held for the first time in nearly 3 years.
We all know that it's not going to be easy. It's going to be hard with ups and downs. But I can assure you that in these negotiations, it's not our intention to argue about the past, but to create solutions and make decisions for the future.
Livni said the biggest success of the talks so far was that her government is now talking to the Palestinians directly. Previous peace talks collapsed in 2010 over settlement building in the West Bank, which Palestinians see as land grabs and Israel sees as critical for national security. Jerusalem is another stumbling block, with both sides wanting the city to be their national capital.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Dermot, according to my notes here, that the Israels had to pay a high price to enter into these negotiations with the Palestinians by releasing 104 Palestinian prisoners with blood on their hands. According to my notes here, they've been responsible for the death of 55 Israeli civilians, 15 Israeli soldiers, 1 female tourist, and dozens of Palestinians suspected of collaborating with Israel. What is the Palestinian Authority doing? Israel's made a huge sacrifice to enter into these talks. What is the Palestinian Authority doing to enter into these talks?
Well, first of all, I think you're right. It has been a very high price Israel has paid. It was a very difficult decision for the Israelis to take. The Israeli cabinet were split on the issue and discussed and debated it for reasons you can understand. For their side, the Palestinian Authority haven't matched that with any equivalent move, but they have entered into the talks. It was previously one of the things that has prevented the sides getting together was the Palestinian side were insisting on a series of preconditions. They wanted the Israelis to agree to sort of issues around borders and various other preconditions before going into the negotiations. What they've done to enable this is to essentially give up those preconditions. So what John Kerry said in Washington was that all issues are on the table. So that was what they had to give up. But I can entirely see your point. That the difficulty, the emotional difficulty for the Israeli people to release these convicted criminals was a high one. And
I've also got a personal story of a young lady called Adi Moses, who wrote this article in an Israeli newspaper after her brother and mother was killed by one of these released terrorists in 1987, and as they threw a firebomb at their car. And this is what she said. She said, "I was 8 years old when this happened. While my father was rolling me in the sand to extinguish my burnt body, I looked in the direction of our car and watched as my mother burnt in front of my eyes. With your decision to release the murder, you spit on the graves of my mother and my brother Tao. You erase this story from the pages of history of the State of Israel, and in return for what?" So can you share with us, Dermot, the cost that Israel is prepared to make in terms of reaching peace with the Palestinians?
Well, that's clearly a very heartbreaking story, and you wouldn't wish that upon anyone, any child, to have to experience that, and there are more stories like that within Israel. One of the organisations I've had the privilege to meet is called, I think it's called Bereaved Families, and it brings together families from both of Israelis and Palestinians who have been bereaved during the conflict in different ways, and the experience I can report from them is living through something like that and that loss. They have initially a great sense of anger and grief, very frankly, very raw grief. And what this organisation does is to bring some of these families together. And often it's very, very difficult. But what often people do is when they've experienced that loss and they want to commit to that loss, they want to make some meaning of that seems like a very senseless loss, they often put that into a quest for reconciliation and coexistence between the sides. But I don't think any of us should underestimate the price that Israel is paying in doing this, but also not underestimate the consequences of failing, because there will be more deaths, there'll be more bereavements, there'll be more grieving families on all sides if the Israelis and Palestinians don't get together and sort this out.
And we've got another news clip to go to on this one, entitled "Why Release Palestinian Prisoners Prior to Peace Talks," and this is a news analysis piece on the current prisoner release.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has agreed to release over 100 Palestinian prisoners as a confidence-building gesture in the renewal of peace talks with the Palestinian Authority. In a controversial move, Netanyahu managed to receive support for the decision and has convened a special committee in order to assess the identity of the prisoners, some of which have blood on their hands. Many Israeli negotiators oppose the release of any prisoners prior to negotiating the peace agreement.
It's not that we're against the release of prisoners, it is the context. If there will be, see the Shalit deal. Israel released 1,027 most dangerous prisoners, and still the public accepted it. Why? Because it was for a real deal. Here, the public feels that we paid something, or we indicated our willingness to pay something without really getting something in return. The basic rules in these type of negotiations argues that you don't pay anything in order to enter to the negotiations. Why? Because negotiation itself and engaging in negotiation should be, and I think it is, mutual interest of Netanyahu and Abbas.
However, other experts explain why such a gesture is necessary for peace talks to begin.
I think this has to be seen, first of all, as a confidence-building measure. It was particularly important to the Palestinians because Abu Mazen is weak. He has to show something to his public. And particularly after the release of the Hamas prisoners in exchange for Gilad Shalit. Because that presented a situation in which Abu Mazen looked as if his policy of negotiation had totally failed, And Hamas's policy of violence was successful. So I think that's the reason that the major reason that Abu Mazen was asking for the release of prisoners.
If there is so much Israeli contempt in regards to this release, why is the Israeli government still going ahead with it?
Because probably Netanyahu had to face a very hard choice, whether to release prisoners or to freeze settlements. Released prisoners will not bring him into, a lot of tension with his current government partners, mainly Naftali Bennett and his Knesset members. But freeze of settlements will put a real risk on Netanyahu's capability to really ignite the negotiation and continue to govern. So between these two evils, when forced by the Americans to pay a price, Netanyahu chose the only option that could really, that was the least risky for him.
The first round of preliminary meetings between both the Israeli and the Palestinian parties took place in Washington, D.C. this past week, angering many Israelis who feel they have not yet heard of gestures or concessions on the Palestinian side.
I don't know what, on the public sphere, the Palestinians did in order to enter into negotiations. Probably they agreed to maintain or reduce pressure regarding the September UN, their efforts to upgrade their status in the UN. But if this is what the Palestinians paid in order to enter the negotiation, let the public know about it. Because at the moment, it seems that only Israel's paid something in order to enter into negotiation. This really puts Israel in a dramatic disadvantage, and this is not the way it should be.
And yet some wish to stress that all of the Palestinian prisoners who will be released are from a list which was agreed upon some 20 years ago.
This is a commitment that was made when there were a number of mutual commitments made when the Oslo Accords were signed to draw a line on the past. That's why it's pre-Oslo prisoners. It's not terrorists who were arrested in the Intifada, the second Intifada, or in the Oslo period. It's not a numbers game. It's always difficult. Unfortunately, there are many precedents going all the way back, certainly to the 1980s.
With the newest additions to the American mediation team, some hope is demonstrated among Israeli experts on negotiation.
With Martin Indyk professionalism and John Kerry's enthusiasm and the support of Barack Obama, we might see, I'm thinking very carefully, I hope that we will see a different pattern of American mediation. Whether it will yield results, we still don't know.
The real question is, of course, will these talks actually lead to an agreement? We've tried in the past. It's been extraordinarily difficult, indeed impossible. But we can always be hopeful.
With optimism somewhat expressed in regards to reigniting the peace process, Israelis await following the events to come.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report, and that was an excellent news analysis produced by JN1. Dermot, the US Secretary of State John Kerry believes that within 9 months he can achieve peace and see the establishment of a Palestinian state. But really, is it the right time that he should be investing so much diplomatic effort into trying to bring the two sides to a peace agreement when essentially the whole Middle East is up in flames? I mean, you've got the ongoing civil war in Syria, which has claimed the lives of over 100,000 Syrians and caused a refugee problem of 1.5 million. Iran is on the verge of acquiring nuclear weapons, and Egypt's possibly on the verge of civil war. Is this what the United States should be doing this time?
Well, I mean, you can see this both ways. I mean, obviously, any chance to resolve the situation should be taken, as well as seeing there is the argument that all this chaos that surrounds Israel, chaos and insecurity and instability, makes this a bad time. However, there is a counter-argument which clearly has won the day here, which is it gives an opportunity. At the moment, the Palestinians need to come to the table because in part, they're quite isolated. Hamas, who are not part of these talks, is worth remembering. Hamas, who are the de facto rulers of the Gaza Strip, who are a terrorist and Islamist organisation. Their traditional ties to Iran and to Syria, they've been broken. They also had ties to Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood, which have also been broken. So there's also an opportunity that in the middle of all this chaos, that what Israel needs as well, so the Palestinians need some security, and Israel also needs to ensure, while it has chaos in its northern border, Syria has a border with Israel, there's chaos in Egypt and in the Sinai, which is its southern border, there has always been insecurity in Lebanon. And then on its eastern border, it's one safe border. It has a peace treaty with Jordan. Jordan is becoming destabilised by the influx of Syrian refugees. So if you look around the region, it can also be used as an argument to say, actually, well, now is the time where you need to, closest to home, to try and make sure you can bring some resolution to that situation. But I can see also as well, there's, I think, to be slightly less fair on the Americans, their critics would say they don't have a policy, really, a meaningful policy in Syria. Their policy on Egypt and their response to the ousting of Morsi, and was it a coup, wasn't it a coup? Their existing previous policies about reaching out to a unified Arab world are now in shatters. So it may be, their lack of a policy of knowing what to do elsewhere, at least on this issue. Israel-Palestine, they've been doing this for a long time. They feel they understand and they know what to do. So I think there are both good and bad reasons, but whatever the reasons, I think the opportunity should now be taken and used.
But also, couldn't you also argue the fact that Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip and pulled out 9,000 Jewish settlements in the search for peace, only got rockets and missiles fired upon her. And the great danger now is that if Israel engages in a peace process, signs a peace treaty with Abu Mazen, and we see the establishment of a Palestinian state created, and because of the upheavals and the turmoil we're seeing across the Middle East, in which his regime is very, very unpopular amongst ordinary Palestinians, either they would vote in Hamas, or that Hamas would cause a coup d'etat in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and Israel made peace with Abbas one day, and the next day have a Hamas-run Palestinian state on Israel's borders, which for Israel would be an absolute frightening scenario.
I mean, you're very right, Simon, and that's a very, very real concern. A very, very real concern for the Israelis. I mean, when they talk about peace talks between Israelis and Palestinians, it's not all Palestinians. It's only what they call the Fatah faction. Hamas and Gaza aren't part of these talks. So you're not doing a peace deal with them all. Israelis are very mindful about the possibility of what happened in Gaza happening in the West Bank as well. And if the rocket fire from Gaza onto southern Israel is bad enough, which it is, if you stand on the hills of Judea or Samaria, you can see from there, you can see the Mediterranean, you can see Tel Aviv, you can see Ben Gurion Airport. The security concerns Israel would be very, very real. And that's partly why one of the tracks in these talks they need to talk about is ensuring that a future Palestinian state is demilitarized, that there is some protection on the Jordanian border, but also that the other difference, with Gaza, and I think one of the lessons they learned from that was in Gaza it was unilateral. The Israelis pulled out and said, right, okay, you're not going to strike a deal, we're just going to pull out anyway unilaterally. And then they had no control, and what they want to ensure they do this time is have a negotiated settlement. So all these things are agreed, all these issues around border and security and ensuring as far as can be that Israel is left safe, and also having the involvement of the international community to assure that and provide assurance. So part of what the Americans will do after an agreement as well, not only is it about investing money to ensure that the new Palestinian state is stable, but also ensuring that security. And that's why Israel welcomes the involvement of the Americans and the international community. And if the pressure the international community is going to put upon Israel to make a peace deal, there's also a responsibility for them to ensure that the terms of that peace deal are abided by. And the scenario that you outlined doesn't come to pass, and as soon as you have a Palestinian state, it then doesn't start attacking Israel.
And also what troubles me is the Mohammed Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, because news has broke this week that two Israeli businessmen have invested a lot of money in trying to reach out to the Palestinians by setting up a business, which is a Fox fashion clothes store in Ramallah, in which Abu Mazen has come under pressure from opponents who support boycotts and sanctions against Israel, and that this Fox clothes store has been closed down. And not only that, it would have actually provided jobs for over 150 Palestinians. So it would have helped relations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and yet that has been rejected. And if he can't take the courage and the leadership to actually support a grassroots movement for peace, then what chances is there for long-term peace if the Palestinian people themselves are not taught the need to reach out and make peace and reconciliation with the Israelis?
Again, you're right. Coexistence and those sort of relationships, whether they're economic or social, are so important. One of the most unfortunate, perhaps would be a good word, or depressing things to happen in recent years has been the growth of what's called the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, which has sought to impose sanctions and boycotts either on the settlements or on the whole of Israel. But it's such a retrograde, it's such a unhelpful process to do. Another example here in the UK, in Brighton, there is SodaStream, which is an Israeli company, has set up a shop in Brighton. It has a factory in the West Bank, which employs, again, hundreds of Palestinians. There are people in the UK who are seeking to boycott SodaStream, and by doing so, all they will do is deprive jobs to Palestinians in the West Bank, and also close down the sort of economic cooperation which is vital for the future of an independent Palestine. In the future, when there's a Palestinian state and an Israeli state, they will only continue to exist through mutual cooperation and interdependence. And moves like boycotting, moves as you describe in Ramallah, and in not allowing those economic relationships to grow, I just think are against the interests of everyone, Israelis and Palestinians. And if you have any viewers in Brighton, it's a fantastic shop where you can go and get all your SodaStream needs, and I'd suggest you do that.
That's a very good idea, definitely. We're entering into the second part of the programme, which will be discussing the news this week that the new Iranian president has been inaugurated, and he's been portrayed as a moderate and a reformer. And we've got this clip to go to now.
The West has reacted with cautious optimism after Iran's new president said he was determined to resolve the dispute over his country's nuclear program. During his first news conference since his inauguration, President Hassan Rouhani stressed a solution could be reached, but only through talks and not threats. Washington's reaction? That's fine as far as it goes.
There are steps they need to take to meet their international obligations and find a peaceful solution to this issue, and the ball is in their court.
While Russia agreed that it was time for dialogue, not ultimatums, Israel's Prime Minister remained adamant that only pressure would bring results.
Iran's president said that pressures do not work. Not true. The only thing that has worked in the last 2 decades is pressure. And the only thing that will work now is increased pressure.
Western countries and Israel have slapped economic sanctions on Iran, believing it's secretly trying to develop atomic weapons. Iran says it's for peaceful purposes, but talks on the matter remain deadlocked.
Welcome back to the Middle East Reports. Dermot, what do you make of the inauguration of the new Iranian president, Hassan Rouhani, in which he's been portrayed as a moderate and a reformer by very much of our British media and also by our own political leaders, including the Foreign Office?
Well, moderate and reformer, these are relative terms. I think if he is a moderate, he's a moderate in a very extremist range of views. As they say, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. I'll believe he's a reformer when he reforms. I mean, one of my favourite lines is, don't tell me you're funny, make me laugh. you can't just say you're a reformer. You have to demonstrate that you are. And I think, I think there is a wish fulfillment as kind of a hope. People in the West would like there to be a reformer. They would like Iran to elect someone who would take them on a gentle road to reform. I would like that. So I think maybe people are getting a bit ahead of themselves. There's certainly no evidence as yet that he is. But I think we need to wait and see what he does to judge his actions. I think, although there are some welcome noises, the policy of the Foreign Office in the UK on the nuclear threat that Iran poses remains the same. And they need to, the very strict and effective sanctions which have been imposed will stay in place until there is a removal of the threat of the Iranian nuclear program. And I think that's the right response to take. It would concern me if there was talks about, or if there was talk here about somehow lessening those sanctions in advance of any concrete steps from the Iranian regime.
Yeah, I mean, my own personal analysis of this one, of Rouhani's election as the new president of Iran, is a masterstroke by the Iranian Supreme Leader Khomeini, by portraying Rouhani as a moderate and a reformer, has really won his support amongst the Iranian people who voted for him in the first place against the belligerent Ahmadinejad, and secondly, his relationship with the international community, because he was one of the chief negotiators on the Iranian nuclear file, for example, and I think Jack Straw, our foreign secretary at the time, had very close relations with him, means that this means the West could be fooled and deceived into a new dark era of Iranian deception, in which he will push for the West to not enforce stronger economic sanctions, knowing the regime was on the verge of economic collapse. And secondly, it will allow more talks to happen. And when more talks go on, then Iran is that one step closer to developing nuclear weapons. And according to my notes, Dermot, I made before the programme, Rouhani's own track record, he's no moderate. He was responsible for the crackdown on the student protesters we saw with the Green Movement in 2009. He was the leader of Iran's National Security Council that exported Iranian-sponsored terrorism around the globe, and also provided diplomatic cover for Iran's nuclear program. Shouldn't the West be concerned?
I think your analysis is spot on, Simon. I think that there is nothing to indicate in Rouhani's past record that he is a reformer. I mean, it's important, you mentioned the Supreme Leader. Of course, Rouhani is only the president. He's not the ruler of Iran. The ruler of Iran is the Supreme Leader, as the name suggests, that no one's allowed to stand. No one gets elected without his say-so. So I think we should all be extremely cautious. Having said that, I mean, as I said earlier, if Iran was to change its behaviour, then we should welcome that. But we need to see the behaviour change first. And I fear what you say may well be true, that what they've decided, the Supreme Leader has decided to present a story of reform and moderation, but not the reality. And I think we all need to wait and see, and not change either our analysis or our behaviour or the treatment that Iran gets until those changes happen. And one more thing that you say, I'd like to come back on as well. The Iranian regime is an extremely sophisticated and clever regime, and no one should underestimate it. In terms of their nuclear program, which has been going on for decades, they have played a cat and mouse game with the West. They've been engaged in talks. At the same time as they're engaging in talks, the centrifuges are whirring back in Iran and they're making bombs. And through that, they have got closer and closer and closer. So do not underestimate the Iranians, either how sophisticated or how intelligent they are, and let's wait and see what they do, not what they say.
Absolutely. And it's worth knowing the Iranians invented chess. So they're incredibly master strategists.
They are.
But I just want to give you a quote that Rouhani made 2 days before his inauguration at Al-Quds Day, which is an annual pro-Palestinian rally that took place in Tehran. He said here, and I'll tell you all here, he said, "In our region and under occupation of Palestine and dear Jerusalem, there has been a wound on the body of the Islamic world. in reference to Israel. And this is very much in step with the Supreme Leader, who referred to Israel as a cancer that needed to be wiped out, and also Iran's previous president, Ahmadinejad, who threatened to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. It doesn't seem like his vocabulary or his speeches are any less moderate than Ahmadinejad.
No, I mean, I would describe Al-Quds Day as less of a pro-Palestinian day than an anti-Israeli one. And even those who describe Rouhani as a moderate and a reformer, that doesn't refer to Israel, of course. That's talking about things like internal dissent and the nuclear program. There's no question at all of Iran moderating its language or its rhetoric on Israel. I mean, it can't bring itself to say Israel. It refers to the Zionist entity and so on. So there's definitely no suggestion of that. There's been some dispute over the exact wording of what he may or may not have said, but there's no indication at all from the Supreme Leader downwards that there's going to be any change or recognition of the State of Israel.
And also this poses a major problem for Israel, primarily when President Ahmadinejad was in power, and with his incredibly belligerent speeches and lectures calling for Israel to be wiped off the face of the earth, threatening the world with nuclear annihilation, denying the Holocaust. He was portrayed as he was an extremist. And of course, Rouhani has come along. He speaks fluent English, is kind of seen as a breath of fresh air for the Americans and the EU, who are dying to make peace with the Iranian regime rather than actually go to war against Iran. And yet, how does Israel communicate her message of the dangers of Israel, knowing that almost the whole perception of Iran is beginning to change with the inauguration of Rouhani?
Well, I mean, first of all, you're right to identify the threat. They describe it as an existential threat to Israel. If you're an Israeli and you combine those three things, someone who says they want to wipe you off the map, someone who denies the Holocaust, the worst genocide the planet has ever seen, and someone then thirdly who's seeking to get genocidal weapons. I mean, those three things any rational person would think that constitutes a major threat. I think for Israel, I think Israel could explain itself better in this scenario. I think there are two things. There are the threat that Iran poses to Israel and the region, which clearly Israel feels for the reasons you outlined very, very acutely. However, in addition, I think the Iranians achieving nuclear weapon status is a threat to the whole world, particularly to the free world, to the Western world. It's a threat to us here in the UK, and I think what Israel needs to avoid doing is talking about the only problem with Iran getting the bomb is its threat to Israel, and therefore somehow we need to react to protect Israel. No, the Iran getting a nuclear bomb would completely change the dynamics within the region. Iran sponsors global terrorism around the globe. Within the last 12 months, they have sponsored bombings in Bulgaria and the European Union through their arm Hezbollah. They have funded terrorist organizations. They are threatening the Gulf states. The people who are equally as worried as Israel are the Arab states in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia and so on. Iran is not an Arab state. It's not a Sunni state. It is a Shia Persian state. So the whole regional dynamics would be fundamentally upset. That would quite likely plunge the world economy back into another recession in terms of what happens with oil, and in terms of how Iran would extend its influence across the world with a nuclear umbrella. I think we need to have a better idea about how a nuclear Iran threatens our own interests. I'm not saying we shouldn't be concerned about Israel's, but threatens the UK's and Europeans' interests. And I think in our own interests, which I think the governments do appreciate, which is why they're imposing these sanctions, it is in our interests as well as being in Israel's interests, and actually the interests of the Arab world.
I think that's a superb analysis you gave there. Very well briefed on Iran, and you know, if more people got that message, I think more people would actually wake up to the dangers that the Islamic Republic of Iran not only poses to Israel, but the Arab world and also the free world in Europe and the United States. We got another clip to go to now. Looks at the Israeli Prime Minister rebuffing the Iranian negotiation talks over Iran's nuclear file.
Iranian President Hassan Rouhani has called for serious and substantive talks with the international community about its nuclear program. At the first news conference since his inauguration, Rouhani said he was confident both sides' concerns could be resolved through talks, not threats. The United States has said Mr. Rouhani's presidency presents an opportunity for Iran to resolve the world's deep concerns, and Russia has welcomed Iran's proposal. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu dismissed Rouhani's comments and called for more pressure, not less, on Iran to stop its nuclear program. Talks between the West and Iran on Tehran's disputed nuclear program have seen years of stalemate. Hopes for a diplomatic solution have risen with the victory of moderate Rouhani over conservative rivals.
Welcome back to the Middle East report. Dermot, isn't there a great opportunity for the United States, also for the European Union, and also for Britain to maximise economic sanctions at this time? Because the Iranian regime is on the verge of economic collapse, has a banking crisis, which actually could lead to another revolution in Iran, and then would stop Iran's nuclear program without the Israelis having to take out Iran's nuclear facilities in an airstrike that she clearly doesn't want to do, but if push come to the shove, she would in her defence if it meant another genocide or Holocaust against the Jewish people.
I think everyone's agreed that they want diplomacy to work, and I think all Western analysts and those in Israel also recognise that the current sanctions imposed upon Iran are having an effect. They are biting. They are crippling the Iranian economy. They're paying an extremely high price, economic price, to pursue their nuclear adventurism. And you're right, now is not the time to lessen that. If anything, which the American government is saying, they should be increased. And I think what we talked about earlier, the attempts by the Iranians to suggest they are taking a more moderate and reformist line is a direct consequence of those sanctions that have been imposed. And I think if we are to ensure that talk of reform and moderation becomes reality in actions of reform and moderation, then we need to keep up the pressure. But
the other issue I want to bring up today, which is really extraordinary, and that's what's happening in Egypt right now with the military government in Egypt, and the news that the Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan was going to visit Gaza this week has been cancelled due to the Egyptian military. He was going to do that in support of Hamas and also in support of the Muslim Brotherhood. Is the new military government in Egypt now proving a force for moderation, and is this now good news for Israel?
I think it's very difficult to predict yet. I think from the Israeli point of view, they know the military current military administration, people are doing that because the peace deal has existed for many decades between Israel and Egypt and has been very important for their stability. During the time of the Muslim Brotherhood government, there was also that peace deal remained. And there were talks then about bringing a ceasefire in Gaza, and that was also very important. I think for Israel's point of view, they don't want to be seen to or to get involved in Egypt's internal politics in any way. However, I think the generals in or the army in Egypt are familiar with dealing with Israelis, and that's obviously reasonably good for Israel. But let's be clear: the current Egyptian government is taking action against Hamas in Gaza in their own interests. They're not doing it for Israel. They're doing it because the jihadists and the terrorists, which Hamas shelters, are also now moving into the Sinai. The Sinai is effectively a no man's land. There are terrorist actions within the Sinai, not only into Israel, but also on Egyptian infrastructure. The Egyptian military is cracking down on the tunnels and the smuggling and the weapon smuggling that goes on into Gaza in Egypt's interests. It is in no one's interest for this sort of lawless, chaotic terrorism to be allowed to continue. So I think for Egypt's point of view, Israel is a second-order issue. They are dealing with it for themselves.
And we got a news clip to look at this, and this one's entitled Erdogan's Gaza trip cancelled.
Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan's planned visit to the Gaza Strip has been cancelled after a falling out with Egypt's interim military government. The visit was meant to put pressure on Israeli authorities to end the naval blockade of the Hamas-controlled territory. Erdogan is a supporter of Egypt's Islamist Muslim Brotherhood Party and has been critical of President Mohamed Morsi's overthrow from government, calling it an unacceptable coup. Yemen's Nobel Peace Prize winner Tawakkol Karman has also been denied entry into Egypt since Morsi's ouster for her support of demonstrations calling for his reinstatement.
Welcome back to the Middle East report. Dermot, the news of what's happening in Egypt I find extremely encouraging, primarily because the 30 million people Egyptians took to the streets of Cairo and other major cities and towns in Egypt to protest against President Morsi. This is when the Egyptian military have actually stepped in. And now for the first time, the Egyptian people really know the difference between Islam and Islamism, and the political Islamism that was being pursued by the Muslim Brotherhood. And clearly the Egyptian people said, enough's enough, we don't want this. So why are we seeing, for example, the United States government and the EU telling the Egyptian people and the Egyptian military that Morsi has to be back in power?
Well, I'm probably a bit more conflicted than you on it. I thought the demonstration of people power was in fact inspiring, and I did take the same lesson from you when they asked the people who took to the streets what is your problem with the government and with Morsi's government. You know, they had a long list of complaints, which did include, you know, the restrictions on their freedom, the bringing of Islamism as opposed to Islam into the political field, the rights and treatment of women, and so on. All those things were part of it. It was a very sophisticated reasons why they were unhappy with the Morsi government. The bit that leaves me obviously a bit queasy, and probably is the reason why the EU and Americans as well is at the same time you like democratic process. I can see, and you watching it, clearly there was a democratic movement to remove Morsi's government, and I think that's a true thing to say. What I'd like to see now is not a return of Morsi, but the Egyptian military moving as quickly as is possible and sensible to a constitutional form of government and bringing back, democratic processes. I think that's possible, and I think if you look at the last Egyptian elections, there were some quirks and reasons why Morsi ended up winning, which may not be repeated. So I think you're right. The resilience and bravery of the Egyptian people now for some years, first to rise up against Mubarak, and then through this imperfect outcome with Morsi, who then, very narrowly won the election, or in the end, narrowly won the election, and then governed in a poor way without taking any cognizance or any respect for the Democrats and the minorities and the Copts and so on. He governed very badly and has now been kicked out. So I think for them to come back and kick him out shows an incredible desire to be free and to govern themselves in a meaningful way. So I would share your enthusiasm, I think, if once they're in a position to move to constitutional government.
But we've seen very much with our own kind of Western news, our mainstream news channels, anyone would think that it was a military coup d'etat, and that we should be backing the Muslim Brotherhood because they are the elected representatives of the Egyptian people, despite the fact they may have been democratically elected, but once in power, they certainly wanted to dismantle every institution of democracy going, which means they would turn Egypt into an Islamic totalitarian state.
I mean, it was undeniable. There were millions of people on the street. This is a country that has no tradition of freedom and demonstrations. I don't think anyone needs to be concerned that somehow the Morsi government had popular support. And I think there's some validity in the view that the army had to come in to return stability. But what I do think is, and where I would agree with as you characterise it, the American and European view is it would be good for the military now to be caretakers for a constitutional process. And I think that would help protect the rights of Egyptians going forward. But you're right. I mean, the reasons why Morsi, in one sense, only has himself to blame, because his behaviour when he got in, he changed the constitution. He behaved in an autocratic way. As I said before, he had no respect for minorities. And I think if the military were to bring back those constitutional processes,
Dermot, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest today on the Middle East Report. It's been a pleasure to have you on the programme.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's been delightful to be here.
And I want to thank you all for watching today's Middle East Report, as we've summed up the news this week that's affected Israel and the Middle East. And, we have to be on the side of freedom. As Israel enters into new peace talks, let's continue to pray for Israel's peace and protection of her borders, and also that liberty and freedom would break out in Egypt, and that we'd all become aware of the great dangers posed by the new Iranian president. So I want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.
עושה שמיים וארץ, אל יתן למות רגליך, אל ינום שומרך, הנה לא ינום ולא יישן שומר ישראל, השם שומרך, השם צילך, על יד ימינך, יומם השמש לא יככה, והריח בלילה, השם ישמורך מכל רע, ישמור את נפשך, השם ישמור צאתך ובואך, מעתה ועד עולם, מעתה ועד עולם. אשא עיניי אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי, עזרי מעם השם, עושה שמיים וארץ, אל יתן למות רגליך, שומרך, הנה לא ינום ולא יישן שומר ישראל, השם שומרך, השם צילך, על יד ימינך, יומם השמש השם ישמורך מכל רע, ישמור את נפשך, השם ישמור צאתך ובואך, מעתה ועד עולם, מעתה השם ישמור